Hi, it's Lisa with Lisa Heal Yourself, and today I want to do another edition of Helpful or Not. This is a book review, and this book is a very important book, and it's not necessarily about healing. It is called A Man's Search for Meaning by VIKTOR FRANKL. And for those of you who have read this, you know what I'm talking about already. For those of you who have not read this book, it is a very important read, especially for those of us with chronic illness or a chronic disease or a degenerative disease or an illness that feels like we're trudging and walking through hell, like we're trapped, like we are in our own concentration or prison camp. So VIKTOR FRANKL, I'll show you a picture. There's him and his wife. He survived the Holocaust, and he was one of the Auschwitz prison camp survivors, and he was there, and he never gave up hope that he would get out, and he did, and he went on to not only survive, but to thrive, to find meaning in something so torturous and so much suffering, so much, you almost can't even put words to it. And with some of us with chronic painful diseases and chronic painful illnesses, it is akin to being trapped. It is akin to being tortured. When you feel tortured or suffering or the pain is excruciating and you believe you are dying and you're not going to be well. This book, although not about an illness, was a man who was forced into circumstances. He was a victim, like many of you are, but he rose above it with his thinking and with his thoughts. And when he was out, when most people came out and they had PTSD and they were not able to survive in this world anymore, he was a man who put out this book and many ideas and was able to, continue on with his life and have great meaning from it. So I haven't read this book in probably over 2 years, but I don't even know what I've highlighted in here. And probably when I was reading this, I was in my own personal hell. And many of his words struck me as, how it feels to be isolated and alone and tortured and suffer. And so those, cross over. And I don't even know what I've underlined in here because I don't know what I resonated with at the time. But I'm just going to read a little bit about this book, about something that I underlined, or I'm just going to look for it. Normally I have it highlighted, but I think I used pencil in this book because I'm having a hard time finding it. So bear with me here. But can you imagine being in a concentration camp, being gassed, watching people die, watching, both sides of it? And okay, here I have, so anyways, there's a part of the book here, he was, I don't know if I can describe this, but I'm going to try. Okay, so there was a man, a doctor, and he thought he would be liberated and his suffering would finally come to an end. And he said, "When did you have this dream?" And the man said, he gave a specific date, and he said, "And what did your dream voice answered?" Because he had this dream that all his questions would be answered on this one day. And he said, when he whispered that it was like going to be March 30th that this would happen. And when this guy told him about his dream, he was still full of hope, and he was convinced that the voice of his dream would be right. But as the promised day drew nearer, the war news which reached our camp made it appear very unlikely that we would be free on the promised date. Oh yeah, so that must have been in his dream. He thought he would be free by this date, and he believed it, and he was able to stay alive and hold on to hope because he believed this date, this arbitrary date in the future, was the date that he would be free. Anyways, and on that date, when nothing happened, when they were still imprisoned, when the war was not over, he suddenly became very ill. He ran a high temperature. And on March 30th, the day the prophecy had told him that the war and suffering would be over for him, he became delirious, he lost consciousness, and on March 31st, he was dead. And to all outward appearances, he had died of typhus. So, like, I mean, this is just one thing that I had related to back then, and it is so true, right? I used to pick dates in the future. I will be well by this date. I will be well by my birthday. I'll be well by next Valentine's Day. I'll be well by next Christmas. And when next Christmas comes, and when that date arrives and you are not healed, your hope like vanishes. And this guy died. He literally died. He wasn't able to hold on another day. And so our mind holds great power over us, our thoughts, and the meaning that this guy gave that was strong enough to actually kill him. So, you know, when we have that lack taken from us and the hope is crushed, it's very hard to get it back. And that's just a very powerful story of how, you know, like, putting the right things in our mind is important. And so, yeah. Anyway, here he says here, I underlined this part. He says, I think he was talking to some of his comrades in this part of the book, but he says, they listened to me, you know, in their hours of darkness, and I told them they must not lose hope, but should keep their courage in the certainty that the hopelessness of our struggle did not detract from its dignity and its meaning. I said that someone looks down on each of us in difficult hours, a friend, a wife, somebody dead or alive, or a God, and he would not expect us to disappoint him. He would hope us to find suffering proudly, not miserably, knowing how to die. So he believed, I guess, that there was a sacrifice, and his sacrifice had meaning. His journey had meaning. So he chose to give this horrible circumstance, this horrible, you know, life that befell him in these prison camps. He looked at his suffering, that it had meaning for somebody, for something. There was a dignity about him doing it. There was a meaning that he attributed to it greater than himself. And that's how he was able to hang on. That's how he was able to withstand it, the torturing, and withstand the hopelessness and not knowing if it will ever end, and being one of the people who didn't take their own life. A lot of people took their own life in the prison camps. It was too hard. And by attributing meaning to what he was going through, he was able to survive it. And that was, you know, one of the ways he coped with it in there, but after he got out as well. So here I've underlined another part here. It says some questions. Their questions was, will we survive the camp? For if not, all this suffering has had no meaning. Which, I mean, when you have a chronic illness, you think, am I going to get better? For if it doesn't get better, it has no meaning. If I'm not healed, if I'm not able to tell my story, if I'm not able to be the one that heals, then this has no meaning. He said the question which beset me was, has all the suffering, this dying around us, a meaning? For if not, then ultimately there is no meaning to survival. For a life whose meaning depends on such happenstance as whether one escapes or not, ultimately would not be worth living at all. So powerful, right? Okay, so I'm just gonna look a little bit more here. Let's see what else I've underlined here. Here he says here, after all, man is that being who invented the gas chambers of Auschwitz. However, he is also that being who entered those gas chambers upright with the Lord's Prayer on his lips. So he is saying, we have come to know man who he really is. We are all the same. Man is man. Man is the same man who invented the gas chambers, is the same man who entered it. And those men are both in conflicts. One doing the deeds that they don't want to do, and one living the deeds being pushed on them. And he was able to see those human beings as the same. He was able to see those he says here, a human being is not one thing among others. Things determine each other. But man is ultimately self-determining. What he becomes within the limits of endowment and environment he has made out of himself. In the concentration camps, for example, in this living laboratory and on this testing ground, we watched and witnessed some of our comrades behave like swine, while others behave like saints. Man has both potentialities within himself. Which one is actualized depends on decisions, but not on conditions. So for him, you know, he saw everybody living this life, and he was able to make like a meaning out of it. He was able to see that man was capable, for instance, he writes here, man is capable of changing the world for the better if possible, and of changing himself for the better if necessary. Man does not simply exist, but always decides what his existence will be, what he will become in the next moment. So as you can see, this is very philosophical. It's when one goes through a crisis, when one goes through an illness, when one goes through an experience, when one goes through something that there are no human words for, you must find meaning in that. You must understand that your choices, your decisions, and your thoughts are still your own. And the meaning that you give your thoughts are the thoughts that carry you to the life you will eventually lead. So if you give meaning to your illness, like I'm always going to be sick, I'm never going to be better, that is the life you're eventually going to lead. If you give your own illness meaning, like this is happening for a reason, I am strong and I am getting through this, and when I'm on the other side, I will see that I will be so grateful for having gone through and having learned all the lessons that I needed to learn for my life to be the kind of human being that I need to be in this world. So it's the meaning that you give sometimes, your experience, that ultimately decides how you're able to cope in that moment, but how you're able to experience what you're going through, rationalize it, and how you're able to learn from it, grow from it, and ultimately help other human beings. And I think that's what makes a journey, you know, from sickness to health. That's what makes a journey from suffering to peace and love and joy. And anyways, I would never do Viktor Frankl's book justice by any kind of a review, but it was an important read for me, especially when I was in the depths, knowing that there are other beings in other life circumstances who have also been to the very depth that their soul can go, and they didn't break. They gave it a meaning far beyond what there are even human words for. They carried on, you know, and they ultimately rose to the top. They rose to where they wanted to be with gratitude and meaning in their heart. And I think ultimately that is a road from sickness to health as well. And so I would definitely recommend this book. I think it's an invaluable read, and I think that although it's depressing, although it will bring you down, and although you may not be able to be in a place where you're able to read it yet, sometimes when you're in that place, knowing that someone else has been there, listening to them go through it, hearing the depths of somebody else speaking to you, can make you feel heard and understood in a way that maybe you have never thought of before. So In this case, I definitely say it's a very important read, and it was helpful. It's an invaluable read from a perspective of just going through an experience that is beyond your capabilities to experience. And so that's why I would recommend it for anyone who is that kind of sick, who is going through the illness and the suffering, and you really have no human words for it, and that's what this, helps with. So I hope this review has been helpful, and I'll see you in the next edition.